I'm Luca Giliberti, contributing writer for Gold Derby, and I'm joined today by Lee Eisenberg, the showrunner of Lessons in Chemistry. And Lee, I know that the Lessons in Chemistry pilot was the first script that you had ever written by yourself. So
Yeah.
to start things off, I'd just be curious to hear from you whether that was always the plan from the beginning, and if so, why did you think that this script was the right foray into solo writing for you?
I read Bonnie Garmus's book, I think over the course of a weekend. I just absolutely devoured it. I thought it was so beautiful. The story turns were surprising. I found myself crying. I was laughing. My wife and I were kind of, reading lines aloud to one another. And so I really, I just connected to it. I felt like there was such a clear path for me. And even though I think I'm best known for comedy writing and maybe I wouldn't have been the first kind of logical choice for a, female scientist in the 1950s. I had a 1-year-old at the time, and so a lot of the parenting stories really connected to me. It's about a character who has their walls up and is over time allowing unknown variables to kind of come into the experiment of life. And so I think as a new father, as a new parent, so many of those things were resonating for me, in this idea of kind of it taking a village and really finding your tribe and finding your community. All of that was really resonated for me. And my initial conversations with Michelle Lee at Apple, who had brought the book to me, and we had been discussing it. I've been at Apple. I've had a deal at Apple for 5 years, and there's no better partner in terms of allowing you to kind of see the best version of yourself and really giving you that trust. And so having that trust from Michelle and all of all the executives at Apple was crucial. And then it was my early conversations with Brie Larson, who ultimately became my partner in this. And Brie wasn't only the star of the show, she was an executive producer. She found the book initially with Michael Costigan and Jason Bateman at Aggregate brought it to Brie. And so that was kind of the genesis of this. And I was brought in after that. And so really those early conversations that I had with Brie and what we talked about, what resonated for us with the book, opportunities that we found that kind of, to take little aspects of the book and really kind of expand on it. All of that was really exciting and really felt like we were speaking the same language. And even though we had never worked together before, I was a fan from afar. We immediately connected, and she's become a very close friend.
Yeah, that's nice to hear. And one of the things you mentioned, that it's really about, having your walls up in a way and then having them come down in a way. And that kind of takes me to the story. And I kind of want to start with Elizabeth, and specifically with Elizabeth's backstory, of which we get some in episode 2, and, but the bulk of which we kind of see in episode 6, and which is so crucial to understanding her relationship with her father, her relationship with Faith, and just understanding some of her character traits in general. So why did you choose to wait until the 6th episode to, flashback to her childhood? And how did you go about weaving those flashbacks into, the main central narrative?
We talked a lot about time in the construction of the show, and the book at times, shifts perspectives and can be nonlinear. And it felt more than anything that we talked a lot about surprise, and that life does not go according to plan. And it's only when you kind of look back on it that it all kind of makes sense. And it's like, oh, of course I missed my flight. And as a result of that, I ended up at the Denver airport where I met my wife. And, but, the plan was to go to New York, and, or you don't get the job that you always dreamed of, but yet that set you off on a different career path. And all of those kind of personal stories that, we were discussing in the writer's room, and the way that kind of the metaphor of that with science, and kind of, the way this discovery works in terms of experiments and the number of failures you have before you have a success. All of that was the way that we wanted to approach the storytelling of the show. And in a show that, I often joke that it's like, so many shows are like, oh, the president's daughter was kidnapped and you need to deactivate the bomb by this time. Lessons in Chemistry isn't that. It's so based in character, and
Yes.
having these reveals, over the course of the season was something that was very important to us. And it's the same way that when you get to know a close friend, and what you see on the surface is one thing, and that's painting, part of the portrait of a character, a part of the portrait of a person. And then over time, the layers kind of unfold, and you say, oh, I see, because of your relationship with your father, that's why you're this. Oh, I see, because you moved around a lot when you were a child, that's why you're this. And how the past informs the present so much was kind of, one of our North Stars as we kind of delved into the kind of building out this world.
I really like how you put that, how life doesn't necessarily make sense in the moment, when you have all these curveballs being thrown at you, but in hindsight is when it makes sense. I feel like that's such an interesting way to put it. And you really do see that in the show and through Elizabeth's journey. So I really like that you mentioned that. Yeah, and one of the things that we see in these flashbacks is that her brother obviously commits suicide. And when I talked to Millicent Shelton, who directed that episode, the way she put it is that the day Elizabeth loses her brother is also the day she really becomes estranged from her father, and is basically the day her father loses both of his children. So how would you say that the loss of her brother and the estrangement from her father then, influences the person she becomes? How do those things help characterize the Elizabeth that we see at the outset of the series?
Well, I'd say a few things. Number one, no one is purely evil, no one's purely good. So Elizabeth gained from her father the ability to stand in front of an audience and to make people see the best versions of themselves. And there is a belief to Elizabeth. I think that Elizabeth is decent, and her father kind of used his salesmanship and his kind of standing on a podium, standing at a podium was used for evil. And her brother kind of introduces her to science, and and the kind of the magic of science is something that's kind of born early on for her. But I think that for Elizabeth, that's the beginning of someone who had to kind of tackle the world on her own. Her brother was the closest person to her. She loses him tragically. I we mentioned at a point that Elizabeth stays with her parents, I think until she graduates high school, but they were never the same after that. And so as soon as she's able to, she's out of that house. And I think when the people closest to you betray you in the way that her father did, and to a certain extent her mother did as well, that's where the walls start to get built up. And that's the beginning of Elizabeth hardening herself and kind of like girding herself, to be in a world where people aren't going to be decent and truthful, and that she feels that the only way that she can make it through is by keeping people out. And it's not until she meets Calvin that she really allows someone to come in.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to get to Calvin in just a second, but I feel like on that note about, that's when the walls kind of come up. I feel like it's also important to mention the sexual assault that she experiences at the hands of a academic advisor in 1950, because that also has such an impact on who she later becomes. And when I talked to one of the show's editors, Matthew Barbato, he mentioned that there was a lot of discussion about how and whether to, depict this assault. So can you take me back to some of those discussions and maybe explain how you ultimately landed on the depiction that we see on the show?
Sure. I think again, the relationship that Elizabeth had with her mentor at UCLA is another example of an older male figure that Elizabeth had put her trust into, which I'm sure, based on her relationship with her father and where she had arrived, that was probably the beginning of something where she was like, oh, okay, this is, we're two scientists, we're working together, we're going to build something great together. And that betrayal in such a graphic and gruesome way is part of her journey, in terms of the walls. In terms of the way that we portrayed it, we talked a lot about not shying away from things that make the audience feel uncomfortable. We never wanted to be gratuitous about it. We never wanted to feel like we were doing it to be manipulative in any way. We wanted to be honest, and we wanted the audience to feel uncomfortable. Another example of that, and we really debated both of the examples, was the length of the assault, was something that we worked in the edit with, and I do this a lot in the edit. I really bring in as many people as I can, and I just want to get as many perspectives as possible, and particularly for moments that are as sensitive as that and will be as triggering for the audience as that. It's so crucial, and I feel a tremendous amount of responsibility to get that right. The other moment that was in Millicent's episode was in episode 6, the protest at the freeway.
Mm-hmm.
We tried different versions of it, and Millicent cut it together in a certain way, and it was long, and it was violent, and it was uncomfortable. And the feedback that we got was, it's long, it's uncomfortable, it's violent. And we looked at it and played around with it. And ultimately, we just went back to Millicent's version. It was, and that's my instinct from the beginning was, this is Millicent's vision. And I really wanted to honor it. And she, from the moment that we hired her to, as we started storyboarding that sequence, and, to shut down even part of a small freeway in LA is not casual. And there was VFX and there's cranes, and, that had to be shot in such an economical way. I don't remember how many, I think we had 3 or 4 cameras going that day. I mean, it was, and I remember seeing the footage and just, it really kind of, it's stopping me in my tracks. And that was another example of, yes, it's meant to make you feel uncomfortable, and we could have shortened it and that would have lessened the uncomfortability, but that would not have been honest or truthful to the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. When I talked to Millicent, she also talked about how the stuntsmen who were playing the police officers, how she had to tell them to be, to go more at it, how they were kind of hesitant to go at it. And she was like, we got to be truthful to what actually happened. We have to be truthful to this real protests that this is based on. So I think it's interesting that you mentioned that.
And I think there was also a dynamic between the relationship between Elizabeth and Harriet, and, Elizabeth has this, has a platform, and she's able to, to affect change, and people really listen to her, and she's able to speak truth to power, and she's able, Elizabeth is someone who's not a shrinking violet, and she stands up to Rainn Wilson's character and the men at Hastings. But you see Harriet has a completely different perspective as a Black woman during that time, which is a completely different experience than being a white woman during that time, and dealing with sexism. And then on top of it, for Harriet, it's this kind of overt racism, and her entire family and neighborhood is going to be displaced. Is a very different experience. And her challenging Elizabeth is one of my favorite moments in the series. I mean, those 2 actresses, I mean, I'd watch them read the phone book, but it's so powerful.
I would watch them read the phone book as well. And, let's stay on Harriet, played by Asia Naomi King, because obviously one of the biggest changes the show makes from the book is the reimagination of, or the complete reimagination of Harriet. And I understand that you were reimagined the part after Asia had already auditioned for another role, and you were just so impressed by her work. So what was it that she brought to the table that made you say, let's reconceptualize this very important central character of Harriet so that Asia can play her?
Yeah, I mean, it was one of those things where I knew Asia's work a little bit, and I just, in our initial conversations, she's so warm, she's so thoughtful, she's so soulful, and really funny. And I felt like, man, seeing Brie and Asia in scenes together, and this kind of surprising friendship forming, and them having very honest conversations about motherhood and about Calvin, and these 2 people being brought together through tragedy, and that they lean on each other, and they become a family to one another. And again, it doesn't, with your family, like I love, as I said, that Harriet is challenging Elizabeth, that it's not just the 2 of them getting along always. They are there for one another, support one another, but they're going to challenge the other.
Yes.
And I thought that was really important. And I just thought, okay, so we have this actress that I've become obsessed with, working with another actress that I'm obsessed with, Brie and Asia. And so I'm going to have to find another actress. And by finding that other actress, that will mean that there's fewer scenes with Asia. And I was like, okay, can we just stop for a second? Let's just talk about this. Is there a way? And as we started talking about what that, it was just taking away screen time in a way that I felt was not going to I really wanted to dive in and connect with the characters that mattered as much. I want to be with them kind of selfishly as much as I could be, and I didn't want to share screen time with Asia and whoever we ultimately would have, cast as Harriet. And so as we looked at that time period and this neighborhood of Sugar Hill, and it really started to come together very quickly in the freeway protests, and Harriet as kind of this budding lawyer.
Mhm.
It all started to fall into place, and Harriet having 2 kids, having her husband, having, that he had been enlisted, and that, he was coming back, like all of these things that felt so of the time and felt
Mhm.
so organic in terms of what's Harriet's relationship with Calvin, the fact that Calvin and Harriet, that the last thing Calvin had done with his relationship with Harriet was disappointed her. He didn't show up to the meeting. And that to lose someone that you loved and that you cared for so much, but that the last moment you had with them was a fight,
Yeah.
that things are unresolved. I mean, all of those things, it felt like great grist for the mill in terms of as a storyteller. It was things I was excited to kind of delve into.
Yeah, and that's what I like so much about the character, because that she is an actual character, right? The show explores her marriage, it explores her friendships, it explores her home life, it explores her activism, her profession, her ambition. Because there is a version of this where she is just a vessel in Elizabeth's story, where she's just a vessel in the main narrative in general, given what she and her story kind of add to the show. So I like that the show avoids that and actually gives her a proper character. But so it's interesting also to hear that you kind of took everything from that kind of fit to the time and then kind of injected it into the character, if I understand that correctly.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah. And then, on a final note, I do want to talk a bit about Elizabeth and Calvin, because what's really great about the show is that, as we said, Elizabeth's walls come down a bit as these different people enter into her life, starting with Calvin. And what's so beautiful about their relationship is that it's ultimately these two souls meeting their mates, if I could put it like that.
Yeah,
Meeting someone who meeting someone who understands them, meeting someone who understands their idiosyncrasies. So talk a bit about, fleshing out that relationship, and how feeling genuine love or meeting this soulmate, how that changes each of these two characters.
I think it's said in the show, or maybe we said in the writers' room, but when you love someone, you love all of them. And I think that it was important for us to kind of create this beautiful love story and then have it yanked away. And there's so much that they didn't know about one another. There's so much you see these glimpses. Episode 7 is another episode where we play with time, and you see scenes that occurred, kind of during the same kind of time period, but like, Calvin buying the engagement ring and talking about Elizabeth to a stranger. Some of those moments I was really immensely proud of, and really excited to kind of see where these characters, what they felt about one another and what they were able to say and not say, because the relationship ultimately was cut far too short. And that's the way life goes sometimes. And so both of the characters, when you meet them, they both have walls up, and they're so focused on their science and their experiments and discovery that everything else is kind of cast aside, and they fall in love over their mutual passion for science and chemistry, and specifically biogenesis, which is the origins of life, and which is so ironic and beautiful and poetic that that was something that Bonnie had put in the book, it's the origins of life is love, it's creation, it's mad. It's it's the fact that they have a daughter that Calvin never got to know, and that everything that kind of springs from Calvin and Elizabeth is a whole world that that Calvin he's kind of the catalyst of, and yet he's not able to kind of share in any of it.
Yeah. And then it gets ripped away from her so quickly. I will tell you, I watched that episode with a book reader. I had not read the book. So they knew what was coming. I did not, the second episode. So that was also an experience, just watching that. And I think for a lot of people, just absolutely heartbreaking. But it's nice to see her journey afterwards. You kind of talked about how it's about finding a community, finding a tribe, and that's what you see after that. So it's just a beautiful evolution for Elizabeth.
And one of the goals that we had was, and part of this again, you know, once you get into casting, it becomes a very different thing than scripts or whatever. Was Lewis Pullman is miraculous. He's a revelation. And so as soon as I saw the dailies and I saw my wife's reaction to the dailies specifically, I was like, okay, we need to find more ways of having him in the show. And I felt there was very honest, you know, I didn't want it to feel manipulative in any way, but we talked a lot about loss and death and in the writer's room, and how we remember the dead, how they find their way back to us, and that you are able to move on, but you always, you know, that person always has a piece of you, and you always have a piece of them. And then doing episode 7, which we called the Book of Calvin, that here's a character that you frustratingly didn't get to know enough of. We wanted to kind of, in a way, give you more of him, and also kind of start connecting some of the dots of the mystery that kind of plays out over the course of the season.
Yeah, it's really nice to get that episode. It's, you know, quite surprising if you don't know what's coming. So, but it's really nice that we also got, in a way, some closure, I felt like, with that episode. So, yeah. Lee, we're unfortunately out of time, but thank you so much for walking me through the show and through your process. It's just so interesting to listen to. Yeah, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Great questions.
Thank you.